I got to find Vince. He's in Nashville.
Okay.
But again, his assistant said he's good to go, but it's not easy to find you guys.
You know, Tommy does kind of come over without telling me sometimes. So I don't know where he is, but we can go find him.
Okay.
It's usually in my backyard.
What's he doing in your backyard?
He likes to.
All right, let me ask you something right off the bat. What kind of guy gets into public feuds with Lars Ulrich, Eddie Vedder, Gene Simmons, Godsmack, Steel Panther, and his own former bandmates, sometimes all within the same decade? What kind of guy writes an open letter to a Metallica drummer so savage that people still quote it 30 years later? What kind of guy has a former touring partner literally challenge him to a fistfight on a nationally broadcast podcast? The answer, if you hadn't already guessed, is Nikki Sixx. And look, love him or hate him, the man has never been boring. Not once. Not for a single day in his entire career. And today, we're pulling back the curtain on every major feud, every public blow-up, every "did he really just say that" moment that Sixx has either started or stumbled into over the past 4 decades, because there are a lot of them. We're talking rock royalty going to war. We're talking bands that once shared a stage refusing to share a festival bill. We're talking a man accusing Sixx of saving his life and then never being thanked for it. That one in particular, we'll get to it, is one of the most jaw-dropping stories in this entire video, so don't go anywhere. But let's start from the top, because there's something you have to understand about Nikki Sixx before any of this makes sense. The man behind the myth. Nikki Sixx, born Frank Farana in San Jose, California in 1958, essentially invented himself. Abandoned by his father, then by his mother, raised by grandparents, he moved to Los Angeles as a teenager with almost nothing and turned himself into one of the most iconic rock figures of the 20th century. He co-founded Mötley Crüe, wrote most of their biggest songs, survived a heroin overdose that was declared clinically fatal, wrote a best-selling memoir about it, and came out the other side as a radio host, photographer, clothing designer, and self-made media brand. The man is not lacking in self-confidence. That's perhaps the kindest way to put it. And here's the thing about people who are deeply, almost pathologically self-assured. They tend to speak their minds without a lot of filtering. And when you're Nikki Sixx and you've spent your whole adult life in the rock and roll spotlight, speaking your mind can very quickly turn into a headline, a war of words, or, on more than one occasion, a genuine, lasting beef with some of the biggest names in the business. So let's talk about those beefs, all of them, starting with the one that brought a whole tour to an uncomfortable standstill. Sully Erna and the Crüe Fest Nightmare. The year is 2009. Mötley Crüe is headlining their own summer festival-style tour, Crüe Fest 2, and Godsmack is one of the co-headliners. On paper, it looks like a dream. 2 massive rock acts, huge crowds, packed arenas. In reality, it was the beginning of one of the nastier feuds in hard rock history. Now, nobody ever definitively pinned down exactly what started it on that particular tour, but things between Nikki Sixx and Sully Erna deteriorated quickly. There were whispers of a diss track, whispers of disrespect, and a whole lot of social media shade being thrown in multiple directions. And then, in 2015, 6 years after that tour, the gloves truly came off. Erna appeared on The Josta Show, hosted by Hatebreed's Jamie Josta, and when the subject of Sixx came up, Erna did not hold back, not even a little. He called Sixx out by name and was about as direct as a human being can be, saying he'd never met a bigger, quote, certain expletive in his life. He called him a douchebag. He said, and this is remarkable, that Sixx knew exactly where to find him if he ever had the courage to look him up. Now that's not ambiguous. That's not a little Twitter shade. That is a formal, on-the-record, publicly delivered challenge. That is a man throwing the proverbial glove at someone's feet. Sixx's response? He called Erna a baby on a Facebook live stream, then declared that Mötley Crüe would refuse to play any festival if Godsmack was also booked on the same bill. 2 grown men, multi-platinum careers, a rivalry that apparently started because of a road tour, and it somehow escalated to the point where Sixx was essentially vetoing festival lineups. Does that sound about right to you, or is this the kind of rock and roll drama you expected from Nikki Sixx? Drop a comment below. I'm curious whether you think these feuds make the music world more interesting or just exhausting. Lars Ulrich and the most savage open letter in rock history. Now we need to talk about Metallica, because this one is both hilarious and kind of brilliant. Mötley Crüe and Metallica have never exactly been soul brothers. You've got two very different bands coming from two very different scenes. The glam-soaked Sunset Strip on one side, the thrash metal underground on the other. Philosophies, their aesthetics, their entire vibes were almost cosmically opposite. And from early on, there was no love lost. According to accounts from the era, Lars Ulrich was at a show in Hollywood in 1982 and, reportedly a bit worse for wear, screamed something highly unflattering about Mötley Crüe from outside the Troubadour. Sixx allegedly chased him, and so began what may be the longest-running petty feud in rock music history. But it was 1997 that really lit the fire properly. Metallica's Lars Ulrich publicly accused Mötley Crüe of using backing tracks during a performance at the American Music Awards. Now, whether or not he was right isn't really the point. The point is what happened next. Sixx sat down and wrote an open letter to Lars Ulrich. And friends, it is something. It opens by calling Ulrich "Dear Sweet Fat Balding Lars" with a Z, which tells you immediately how charitable this is going to be. It gets worse from there. It brings up hypocrisy, glass houses, and ends with something about returning the punch. It is rude, it is petty, it is spectacular, and it is exactly the kind of thing that makes rock and roll feel alive. The beautiful irony? By 2003, Sixx was publicly defending Metallica's polarizing Saint Anger album, saying he had learned to have sympathy for the enemy. And their bands had actually overlapped in a meaningful way. Mötley Crüe hired producer Bob Rock for Dr. Feelgood, and years later, Metallica hired the same producer for the Black Album. In a weird way, they were connected by creative DNA, even while publicly lobbing grenades at each other. That's rock and roll, folks. Eddie Vedder and the Great Authenticity War. This one gets philosophical, if you can believe it, because when Eddie Vedder and Nikki Sixx beefed, it wasn't really just about music. It was about ideas, about what rock was supposed to mean, about what artists were supposed to look like. In the early 1990s, the grunge wave was washing glam metal off the radio like a tidal wave, and Pearl Jam was one of the bands riding that wave the hardest. Vedder, in interviews from that period, made it clear he wasn't a fan of the Sunset Strip scene, the big hair, the pyrotechnics, the showmanship, the girls, girls, girls aesthetic. He felt that kind of performance was hollow, artificial, more about image than artistry. Sixx didn't see it that way, not remotely. At various points, Sixx called Pearl Jam one of the most boring bands in history. He took direct aim at Vedder's approach to performing, suggesting refusing to entertain, refusing to give the crowd a show wasn't some noble artistic stance. It was just dull. He was sharp about it, too. The implication was clear. The whole grunge authenticity thing looked a lot like a different kind of pose. What makes this one so interesting is the subtext. Both of these men, in their own ways, were performing an identity. Sixx was performing the rock god, wild, dangerous, larger than life. Vedder was performing the reluctant artist, uncomfortable with fame, committed only to the music. Both of those are performances. Sixx seemed to see that clearly. Whether Vedder appreciated the observation is another matter entirely. Steel Panther and the Twitter war that got awkward fast. Now here's one that starts funny and gets a little uncomfortable because the joke ends up landing on Nikki Sixx himself. Steel Panther, for those who need a refresher, are a Los Angeles glam metal parody band, or comedy rock act, depending on who you ask. They're extremely irreverent, deeply self-aware, and they built their entire brand on affectionately lampooning exactly the kind of rock world that Mötley Crüe helped create. The fact that they revere the Crüe is basically foundational to their whole thing. So it was more than a little awkward when, in 2011, touring that put Mötley Crüe, Def Leppard, and Steel Panther on the same bill, Nikki Sixx and Tommy Lee made the newcomers feel about as welcome as a noise complaint. According to Steel Panther members, Sixx and Lee did not enjoy having them around at all. The crew apparently thought Steel Panther was somehow disrespecting them personally, rather than celebrating the whole genre they came from. The feud reignited later when Panther frontman Michael Starr made a joke about Vince Neil, a crack that Sixx did not find funny. He fired back on Twitter, telling Starr to go do something extremely impolite to himself and calling Panther wannabe artists who had no business putting down his singer. And then Steel Panther did something genuinely brilliant. They posted an old MTV interview from 1994, right after Vince Neil was fired from the band, in which Nikki Sixx and Mick Mars can be seen laughing about Neil getting hurt on a jet ski, making some particularly unkind comments about his weight in the process. The message was unmistakable, and the internet loved it. Whether Sixx appreciated the callback is another matter. If you're enjoying this so far, hit that like button and subscribe to Hidden Fame Files. We've got a lot more of these stories, and honestly, rock and roll history is full of gold like this. Gene Simmons and the Prince moment. Now this is the one where genuinely you have to say, Nikki Sixx was right. When Prince died in April 2016, the music world was devastated. One of the greatest artists of the 20th century was gone, unexpectedly, at 57 years old. Artists across every genre paid their respects. The grief was widespread and real. Gene Simmons of Kiss used the occasion to suggest that drug addicts choose their fate, effectively minimizing Prince's death in a way that felt cruel and tone-deaf to a lot of people. It was the kind of comment that makes you wince regardless of where you stand on anything else. Nikki Sixx, who is himself a recovering addict and a man who clinically died of a heroin overdose, was not going to let that slide. He went after Simmons publicly and forcefully, calling his comments disgusting and accusing him of a fundamental lack of empathy. Sixx didn't mince words. He used his platform, his personal experience, and his moral authority as a survivor to push back hard. Interestingly, Paul Stanley, Simmons' bandmate in Kiss, actually sided against Simmons on this one, posting publicly that Sixx was right to call Gene out. He even said Sixx should shut up wasn't the message. The message was that Gene was wrong. That's a remarkable moment, a feud where the target's own partner breaks ranks. And it speaks to the fact that Sixx, whatever his faults and whatever feuds he's generated over the years, was on the right side of this particular argument. John Corabi and the wound that never healed. Okay, this one is painful in a different way. John Corabi joined Mötley Crüe in 1992 when Vince Neil departed, or was pushed out, depending on who's telling the story. He recorded one album with the band, the self-titled 1994 record. It's a fascinating album, actually, heavier and more experimental than anything they'd done before, and it has its passionate defenders to this day. Commercially, it underperformed relative to expectations, especially given that the band had just signed an enormous deal with Elektra Records. The timing was brutal. This was peak grunge era, and Mötley Crüe without Vince Neil just wasn't something the mainstream was ready to fully embrace. Now, for years, Corabi carried that chapter of his life with dignity. He talked about the band warmly, said the record was something he was proud of, and generally conducted himself with more grace than the situation probably warranted. And then, in 2016, in an interview with Sweden Rock magazine, Nikki Sixx publicly said that the album was very unfocused, called the process painful, and delivered the particularly cutting assessment that John Corabi simply can't write lyrics. He said it just like that. No softening, no acknowledgement of what Corabi contributed, just, this guy couldn't write, and I had to carry the whole thing. When asked about it, Corabi said he had no idea why Nikki suddenly felt like he was the biggest piece of shit to roam the earth. He reached out to Vince Neil, his predecessor, the man he'd replaced, and even Neil apparently didn't know what prompted it. Corabi ultimately posted publicly that he was going to stop talking about Mötley Crüe entirely, calling it bullshit stirring. He took the high road with remarkable consistency. What makes it worse and more recent is that as of early 2026, John Corabi has indicated the tension remains and that it's entirely one-sided. After everything, the wound is apparently still open, and it's Sixx holding the salt shaker. Sebastian Bach and the "Did you call me or not" dispute. Here's a quick but juicy one that a lot of fans might not know about. When Vince Neil left Mötley Crüe in the early 90s, the band went looking for a replacement vocalist. Various names were considered, auditioned, or at minimum, floated around the industry. One name that came up was Sebastian Bach, the former Skid Row frontman, a powerhouse singer with exactly the kind of classic rock voice the crew would have needed. The dispute comes down to this: was Bach actually approached or not? Bach has publicly stated, in response to a fan question, that he wasn't merely considered, but was specifically asked to join. He's been pretty clear about that distinction. The crew's account of events, and Sixx's in particular, tells a different story. The implication from their side was that Bach oversold his involvement, that he hadn't really been approached the way he claimed. Now, this might sound like small stuff, but for Sebastian Bach, who spent years navigating the aftermath of Skid Row, questions about where his career could have gone are not trivial. The suggestion that he embellished or misrepresented an offer, even implicitly, cuts at something real. And it's the kind of dispute that doesn't fade. Really get resolved because both sides have their version, and neither is going to give it up. Bret Michaels and the long-running legacy war. Let's talk about Bret Michaels, because this one has an actually satisfying arc. Mötley Crüe and Poison both emerged from the same Los Angeles scene in roughly the same era. Both were hair metal royalty. Both had massive hits, massive tours, and massive drama. And for years, there was a competitive tension between them, a jockeying over legacy, over who the real kings of the Sunset Strip were, whose contribution to the era was more significant. It was never particularly vicious. It was more like two neighbors who've been fighting over a property line for decades, both convinced they're in the right, neither willing to fully drop it. But here's what's interesting. By 2022, Mötley Crüe and Poison shared the stage during a massive stadium tour. The World's Greatest Rock Show, it was called, and it featured both bands, along with Def Leppard and Joan Jett. In front of tens of thousands of fans, the decades of competitive tension got folded into a shared celebration of everything they'd built. That doesn't mean the rivalry is dead. It means the rivalry grew up a little. And honestly, that might be the most rock and roll ending to a feud you can get. Two legends who spent 30 years subtly one-upping each other, finally standing on the same stage, doing the thing they both love for the fans who love them both. And speaking of those fans, which era of Mötley Crüe speaks to you most? The raw, fire-breathing early days of Shout at the Devil, the commercial peak of Dr. Feelgood, or maybe even the underappreciated Corabi experiment? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. Andy McCoy and the overdose dispute. Now, we come to the one that is probably the most personal, the most raw, and the most uncomfortable story in this entire video, and you need to know a little context first. On December 23, 1987, Nikki Sixx injected heroin and his heart stopped. He was clinically dead. He was revived, and that experience became one of the most dramatic turning points in rock and roll history, eventually inspiring Kickstart My Heart, the signature Crüe anthem, and his book, The Heroin Diaries. It's foundational to his mythology. Now, Andy McCoy is the guitarist from Hanoi Rocks, the Finnish glam band that was enormously influential to the whole Los Angeles scene. Hanoi Rocks had deep, real connections to Mötley Crüe, and on the night that Sixx overdosed, Andy McCoy claims he was present. He says he's the one who got Sixx revived, who helped get his heart going again. And he says Nikki Sixx never once said thank you. McCoy went public with this grievance on multiple occasions. He claimed Sixx's account of that night, both in the dirt and in the heroin diaries, was full of lies and embellishments. He said Nikki rewrote what actually happened, and he said that the lack of acknowledgement, the complete absence of gratitude from a man who might literally owe him his life, made Sixx a, quote, second-class citizen in his eyes. Here's the twist. Sixx responded to the Andy McCoy claims in a way nobody quite expected. He said on record that yes, he also, quote, never thanked McCoy for getting him drugs that night. Read that back. His response to, "I helped save your life and you never thanked me," was essentially, well, I also never thanked you for bringing the heroin in the first place. Now, whether that's deflection, dark humor, or a genuinely different account of what happened depends on who you believe. But the fact that this dispute has never been fully resolved, that McCoy still carries genuine bitterness about it decades later, says something. Some debts apparently don't get acknowledged, and some people don't forget. And if you want to support this channel as we dig into more stories like this one, tap the hype button right now. Seriously, if you're enjoying this deep dive into one of classic rock's most fascinating and combustible figures, the hype button is the best way to let the algorithm know this content is worth watching, and it helps us keep making it. We appreciate it more than you know. The Steel Panther postscript and the Gene Simmons aftermath. Let's come back to the broader pattern here, because now that you've heard all these stories, something starts to emerge. Nikki Sixx doesn't really pick fights for sport. I mean, sometimes it looks that way. The Sully Erna thing, the Steel Panther thing, those feel like situations that got away from him, conflicts that grew bigger than they needed to be. But look at the Gene Simmons dispute. Look at his defense of Prince's legacy, of addiction as something more complicated than a simple choice. That's not a man looking for drama. Man with strong convictions and a very low tolerance for what he perceives as injustice or stupidity. The problem, and this is worth sitting with, is that those two things can look identical from the outside. A guy with strong convictions and a guy who just loves to fight can both produce the same headlines. The difference is in the details, and the details with Sixx are always complicated. He's the guy who publicly humiliated John Corabi, a man who by all accounts did his best and contributed genuinely to that 1994 album. But he's also the guy who stood up for Prince when a rock icon was talking nonsense about addiction. He's the guy who called Eddie Vedder boring, which was at minimum debatable. But he's also the guy who, in 2026, told an internet troll exactly where he could go when the troll was fat-shaming Vince Neil online. His response? Quote, "No matter what you think, he's my brother, and you can go suck a..." Well, you get the idea. That's the paradox of Nikki Sixx in 2 words: fiercely loyal and aggressively blunt. Those two things coexist in him, and they always have. The feuds aren't separate from the man. They are the man, for better and worse. What the Mick Mars situation tells us. If you want a window into where Nikki Sixx is in 2025 and 2026, look at the Mick Mars situation, because it's the most recent major conflict, and it's arguably the most painful one. When Mick Mars stepped back from touring in October 2022 due to his long-running battle with ankylosing spondylitis, a painful spinal condition, the public narrative was that it was an amicable parting. And then it wasn't. Mars filed legal claims, argued he was being pushed out rather than stepping aside, and alleged that the band was relying on backing tracks during live performances, the very same accusation that had set Sixx against Lars Ulrich back in 1997. In January 2024, a Los Angeles court ruled in Mars's favor on the question of attorney fees, finding that the band had dragged their feet on handing over corporate documents, and Sixx went after his bandmate of 4 decades publicly, calling the whole thing a crazy betrayal, questioning why Mars would go to war against the people he'd built everything with. This isn't a rock feud in the traditional sense. There are no clever open letters or Twitter jabs here. This is something messier and sadder, a founding member of one of the most famous bands in the world, filing legal papers against his brothers. A man Sixx has known since they were broke kids trying to make it in Los Angeles, now on the other side of a courthouse dispute. That context doesn't make it less interesting. If anything, it makes it more revealing, because it shows that the feuds that really hurt aren't the ones with Lars Ulrich or Sully Erna. Those are sport. The ones that hurt are the ones with people you actually built something with, the ones where the betrayal, real or perceived, cuts deeper than any open letter could. What it all means, the legacy of a man who never shut up. Here's the thing about Nikki Sixx that I keep coming back to after going through all of this. The man has lived his entire public life at volume 11. He's never modulated. He's never learned, or maybe never wanted to learn, the art of the strategic silence. He says what he thinks, when he thinks it, to whoever is in front of him, and then he lives with the consequences. That has cost him. It cost him a relationship with Sully Erna that apparently soured an entire festival circuit for years. It cost John Corabi something real, a piece of his professional legacy, publicly diminished by the man who hired him. It may have cost him the friendship of Andy McCoy, who by his own account put his hands on Nikki Sixx's chest and helped bring him back to life and felt nothing in return. But that same quality, that raw, unfiltered directness, is also what made him. It's what's in Kickstart My Heart, in Home Sweet Home, in Girls, Girls, Girls. It's in the Heroin Diaries. It's in every interview he's ever given where he said something that made a journalist put down their pen and just stare at him for a second. You cannot separate the art from the man, and the man is, whether you like him or not, undeniably, magnificently himself. So here's the real question, and I want you to think about this as we wrap up, because I genuinely want to know what you think. Is Nikki Sixx the rock world's greatest trash talker? A man of deep convictions who just happens to express them like a flamethrower? Or is he somewhere in between? A complicated, flawed, spectacularly entertaining figure who made the rock world louder and stranger and more alive just by being in it? Leave that answer in the comments. I'll read every one. And while you're down there, what's your favorite Mötley Crüe era? Early and raw, mid-period and massive, or something more obscure? We'd love to know. Nikki Sixx is 67 years old as of late 2025. He's survived a heroin overdose that killed him. He's outlasted most of his critics, most of his rivals, and, judging by everything we've covered today, most of his own feuds. He's still touring, still talking, still absolutely refusing to give anyone the diplomatic, measured, carefully worded version of himself. And honestly, the classic rock world is better for it. If you made it this far, thank you genuinely for watching. Subscribe to Hidden Fame Files if you haven't already. We're telling stories about the legends, the moments, and the chaos that made classic rock the most interesting genre in the history of popular music. And if you enjoyed this video, hit that like button. It's the single easiest way to help this channel reach more classic rock fans who'd love content like this. We'll see you in the next one.